It was meant to be the pride of Germany, a floating palace that would turn the oceans into highways. But behind the luxury of the carpets and the gleam of the chandeliers, a darkness was hidden. Cracks in the metal, exploding engines, and the fear that this giant wouldn't make it to shore. Newspapers called it a miracle, but the pilots knew every flight could be their last. It cost as much as an entire fleet, ruined destinies, turned into a financial disaster, and became a symbol of a mad race for greatness. This is not just the story of an airplane, but of a dream that dared to challenge the sky and paid the price. In the first years after the Great War, when Europe was still recovering, the air was already ceasing to be the limit of dreams. It was becoming a road. People who had survived the destruction sought the sky not for romance, but for the future. And among those who saw in steel wings not a weapon, but a bridge between continents, stood a man named Conrad Dornier. He was an engineer who thought not in categories of parts, but of epochs. He was inspired by the idea of the ocean, boundless, changeable, unconquered. But he dreamed that man could cross it not in a ship, but in the air, as if the sea had become an extension of the sky. When he began to build his creation, few believed it was possible. The metallic giant, weighing tens of tons, seemed like madness against the backdrop of wooden airplanes that had only recently creaked in the sky over the fronts. But it was this contradiction that attracted Dornier, to prove that technology and audacity could connect the two shores of the Atlantic. He envisioned a flying ship, capable of taking hundreds of people aboard, smoothly taking off from the water and covering thousands of kilometers without needing runways or airfields. Every one of his notes, every sketch in his notebook, was imbued with this idea. He didn't just want to build an airplane, he was creating a symbol of a new era. In 24, the first sketches of the project, which received the name Dornier Do X, began. No one knew then that these three letters would soon become a legend. But before the giant could take to the sky, it had to go through years of doubt, errors, and almost impossible decisions. In the enormous hangars on the shore of Lake Constance, engineers argued late into the night about how to make the metal hull stay on the water, not sink under its own weight, and then also take off. How to distribute the load so the monster wouldn't fall apart at the first gust of wind. There were no answers. There were only calculations, blueprints, and the boundless faith of Dornier himself, who told his team every day, if nature creates waves, man must create wings to fly over them. None of those standing next to him suspected that they were about to witness the birth of one of the most audacious machines in aviation history. A machine that would challenge not only the laws of physics but also human patience. Its metal panels reflected both the ambitions and the fears of an entire generation that dreamed of the sky but wasn't ready for it to be too high. And when the project finally began to take shape, the people in the workshops were no longer in doubt. They were building not an airplane, but a legend. The giant, destined to become a floating city connecting continents, slowly rose from blueprints, steel, and rivets. Everything around hummed, rang, and vibrated with effort and tension. And Dornier, standing in the shadow of the unfinished hull, looked at it as if he saw not metal, but a living creature that would one day take a breath and spread its wings. But every inspiration has a price. The higher the dream, the heavier it is to lift. And when the water first played under the keel of his creation, everyone understood. It wasn't just a machine test beginning, it was a test of the very idea on which the future of aviation rested. It was at this moment that the dream born on the waves took its first step toward the sky, where not only triumph awaited it, but also a danger that Conrad Dornier did not yet realize. With each month, the project gained not only blueprints and parts, but also doubts. Paper couldn't bear the weight of the ideas, nor metal the weight of the ambitions. The gigantic seaplane demanded from the engineers what they had never done before: power without sinking, lightness without fragility. The factories hummed day and night, like a vast forge where a dream was transformed into metal, and mistakes into new formulas. Dornier stood at the head of this turbulent element. He was not just a designer, he was the conductor of an orchestra of engineers, mechanics, and dreamers, each of whom tried to subdue nature. Problems appeared one after another. Engines overheated even on the test stands. Structural beams couldn't withstand the loads, and calculations of the center of gravity led to the conclusion that the plane simply couldn't take off. In those years, aviation had no ready-made solutions for such dimensions. Everything had to be invented from scratch. The meetings were a mixture of enthusiasm and despair. Someone suggested reducing the number of engines, someone reducing the hull. But Dornier was adamant. His vision did not allow for compromises. The plane had to be exactly as he envisioned it, majestic like an ocean liner and free like a seagull over the waves. To achieve this, they had to combine what had previously seemed incompatible. Inside the gigantic hull, innovative aluminum alloys were used, making the structure lighter yet stronger. The massive floats on the sides served not only as support on the water, but also as stabilizers, protecting the hull from capsizing. The most difficult task was to connect the 12 engines mounted on the wings into a single system. Each worked like a separate heart, and any disagreement threatened disaster. Sometimes, when the shift ended and the workshop fell silent, Claude Dornier would walk along the row of finished panels and touch them with his palm. The metal was cold, but there was life in it. He understood that he was building not just an airplane, but a testament to human belief in the impossible. Every bolt, every rivet was a reminder of how much effort was needed for a dream to take shape. By 29, after endless modifications, calculations, and sleepless nights, something that looked more like a marine vessel than an airplane finally grew in the hangar. Its hull shone in the sun like the skin of an airship, and its wingspan amazed even seasoned engineers. People looked at it and felt not pride, but an awe-inspiring fear. This giant seemed to live its own life, breathing, creaking, creating a roar that made the water by the pier tremble. When Dornier first approached it up close, he said quietly, almost a whisper, "Now you must prove that you were not built in vain." No one answered. Only the wind passed over the rivets and the rustle of aluminum, as if the ocean itself was listening to this promise. Thus, the dream found a body, heavy, cumbersome, frightening, real. A monster of metal stood in the hangar, born of the hopes and mistakes. But the real test was ahead. Soon all of Germany would hear the roar of its engines and understand that the battle for the sky was just beginning. July 12, 1929. On the shores of Lake Constance, the morning began not with the usual fog, but with anticipation. People gathered by the water, as if for a performance that was destined to make history. Before them stood the Dornier Do X, a steel colossus with 12 engines, its wings spread almost 50 meters long. In the sun, it sparkled like a ship of the future, and it seemed as if the very sky held its breath to see if man dared to challenge the elements. Pilot Ernst Kuder was the first to board. He was followed by engineers, mechanics, and observers. Claude Dornier stood on the shore, his gaze fixed on his creation. A moment of silence, and the 12 engines roared to life, turning the air into a shimmering curtain. The water beneath the hull boiled with vibration. The floats shuddered, and the giant began to move. It moved slowly but majestically, like an ocean liner straining for the sky. The first seconds felt like a miracle. The plane lifted off the water, like a seabird breaking free from a wave. The crowd on the shore erupted in applause, but the joy was short-lived. One of the engines began to overheat, then a second. Cutter felt the machine tilt, losing balance. The air buzzed anxiously. The propellers lost synchronization. The plane, which had been held proudly a moment ago, suddenly became a capricious hulk, threatened by an uncontrolled list. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Any mistake could turn into a tragedy. Cutter reduced the thrust, steering the machine back toward the water. It touched the lake with a heavy splash and stopped, as if insulted. The first flight, prepared for years, ended in failure. But for Dornier, this was not a defeat, only the beginning of the journey. That same evening, the hangar came alive again. Tools clanged, lights burned all night. Engineers disassembled the engines, removed cylinders, and rechecked the fuel supply. The overheating was a consequence of the too dense arrangement of the engines. The heat could not escape, and every second in the air turned into a struggle. The cooling system had to be redesigned, the power distribution changed, and a balance sought where mechanics and aerodynamics would stop arguing with each other. Days dragged on in a continuous rhythm. Noise, oil, blueprints, the smell of hot metal. But in these details, confidence was born. The giant could fly. And when the redesigned Do X touched the water months later, everyone in the hangar felt that this time it wouldn't fail. Now, ahead was the flight that had to prove to the whole world that boundaries only exist until someone decides to cross them. 1930. The giant was ready to fly again, but this time not the lake, but the ocean awaited it. An impossible goal, to cross the Atlantic where planes had never flown so far, where the sea was still considered an impassable wall. The Dornier Do X was to be the first to prove that man could connect two continents not by ship, but by wings. The morning of the start was clear. On board were 12 engines, 5 crew members, and several dozen passengers. Diplomats, engineers, and correspondents, summoned to witness the historic crossing. Inside the cabin, there were soft seats, lamps, and mirrors. It looked not like an airplane, but an ocean liner. Everything was designed to show that this was not a desperate experiment, but the future of air travel. But no one knew the price they would have to pay to prove it. When the engines roared, the ground trembled. The water behind them churned, and the huge machine, as if fighting the elements themselves, lifted above the waves. The flight began. From above, the Do X looked like a moving city, heavy but stable. The waves below were a constant reminder that any mistake would be the last. Each engine roared in its own way, creating a drone like an endless prayer. The crew worked without sleep. Pilots relieved each other every few hours to maintain balance and direction. The cockpit was hot. The instrument needles trembled. The air vibrated. Passengers looked out the windows. Beneath them was only water, endless and identical. No one spoke out loud, but everyone understood. They were flying where no one had flown before. Midway, the sky suddenly darkened and the waves began to rise higher. The wind intensified, and the plane started shaking like a paper boat. One of the engines suddenly failed. A metallic groan, the smell of oil, vibration throughout the hull, a loss of power that threatened to crash into the water. The pilots instantly distributed the load among the remaining engines, adjusting the angle of inclination to keep the giant afloat. Minutes felt like hours. Commander Cutter didn't take his hands off the controls. Sweat streamed down his face, but his gaze remained cold and focused. In that moment, there was no audience, no press, only the sky, the wind, and a man who decided that fear could not control a dream. When the storm finally receded and the horizon shone with sunlight again, the crew realized they had passed the point of no return. After long hours over the water, the first outlines of land appeared. New York met them not with the lights of skyscrapers, but with shouts of ecstasy. Crowds of people, flags, cameras, ovations. The world celebrated a victory, unaware of the price. The crew came ashore exhausted but smiling. Claude Dornier stood among them, tired and silent. He knew that today they had conquered not the ocean, but doubt. And yet, behind the noise of the applause, a shadow lurked. The machine that flew through the storm had proven the strength of human intellect. But everyone on board understood that this success was on the edge. The Do X reached altitude, but with it raised a question that would soon become fatal. How many more times could the dream fly before the weight of its own grandeur pulled it down? When the Do X became fashionable as a marvel of engineering, the world looked inside its shiny hull and was amazed. It was not just an aircraft. It was a flying hotel, created with the luxury of an ocean liner and the refinement of a European salon. Soft carpets stretched along the corridors, chandeliers sparkled above dining tables, and mirrors reflected the light as if the sun itself were traveling with the passengers. Here, one could dine on porcelain, sit in an armchair as if in a theater, and look out the windows where the boundless ocean was the stage. The Do X could carry up to 160 passengers, which seemed fantastic in those years. Inside was everything: a kitchen, lounges, even separate compartments for the crew. It was designed not as an experiment, but as a precursor to a new era where the sky would become as familiar a route as the railroad. People who stepped onto its gangway felt not just like travelers, but participants in history. But behind this sophisticated luxury was a harsh reality. The aircraft's design was so complex that it required almost superhuman concentration. The 12 engines, mounted in 3 rows above the wings, worked in a single rhythm, but the slightest disagreement threatened disaster. Controlling this giant was like simultaneously driving a dozen cars on a turbulent river. the pilot could not afford a second of relaxation. The control system resembled a ship's bridge more than a plane's cockpit. Dozens of levers, dials, and gauges, each responsible for balance and fuel supply. Mechanics monitored the engines, engineers the mass distribution, and the pilots, like conductors, combined it into a symphony of flight. And yet, for all the grandeur of its design, the Do X remained capricious. Its enormous hull caught the wind like a sail, and any sudden movement could change the center of gravity. Every takeoff and landing was a test of precision, composure, and faith in the machine. Its twin floats were particularly admired. They made the plane stable on the water, but in strong winds, they turned it into a gigantic sail. Often, takeoff required a perfectly flat sea and complete calm. In any bad weather, the Do X became a prisoner of the elements, not their master. However, people who had been inside did not notice these difficulties. For them, it was the journey of a dream. They sat at white-clothed tables, drank coffee at high altitude, and wrote letters home about how smoothly their enormous airship was flying. They didn't know that, in the cockpit, the pilots clenched the levers until their hands hurt, maintaining balance on the verge of what was possible. The Do X became a symbol of how engineering could approach art, but art requires sacrifice. Behind the beauty lay complexity. Behind the luxury, constant risk. And the more the world admired this marvel, the clearer it became. Perfection of form does not guarantee longevity. Beauty and power can create a legend, but are not always capable of keeping it in the air. After the triumph of the ocean crossing, the Do X was no longer just an airplane. It transformed into a symbol of an era, proof that man could conquer the elements without compromising his nature. Newspapers called it the miracle on the water. Magazines printed photos of the gleaming hull, and crowds gathered on the shores to see the giant takeoff, even from afar. Every flight became an event. Thousands of eyes followed it, as if it were a mythical creature emerging from the water. It set records one after another. No one had ever carried so many passengers in the sky. 150 people on board, a number that sounded like a challenge to the whole world. Its flights were carried out with precision and discipline unknown to civil aviation. Newspapers wrote about it as a triumph of German engineering, and Claude Dornier was invited to receptions where he was introduced as the man who changed the perception of the sky. Monarchs, ministers, industrialists, everyone wanted to be photographed next to the machine that embodied progress. But the louder the applause outside, the louder the problems rumbled inside. The engines, working at their limit, wore out with every flight. Mechanics said the noise under the wings resembled not music, but a warning. Technical reports became alarming. The load on the hull exceeded the design specifications. Fuel consumption was faster than planned. Vibrations destroyed the mountings. Every flight was a celebration. But behind the scenes, it was a struggle to make it happen. The financial side of the project was turning into a bottomless pit. Engine repairs, hull replacement, fuel delivery, all cost astronomical sums. Advertising and public enthusiasm could not cover the expenses. German authorities saw the Do X as a powerful symbol, but not a profit-making tool. And as the excitement began to fade, cold questions arose in the offices. How much more will this cost? Claude Dornier himself, accustomed to standing before the press with confidence, now fell silent more often. He understood that his creation had become a hostage to its own grandeur. Every success made failure even more terrifying, yet he couldn't stop. Too many years and lives had been invested in this project. When the Do X appeared at exhibitions and in port cities, crowds still greeted it as a hero. But those standing closer to the water noticed. The paint on the hull was fading, the engines smoked more often, and takeoff was taking longer and longer. The machine called the triumph of human intellect was slowly turning into a shadow of itself. Thus began the quiet struggle between glory and exhaustion, between how the world sees it and what is actually happening behind the closed hatches. The Do X was still holding in the air, but the feeling of the end was already taking root within it. The very feeling when even the roar of applause cannot drown out the creak of metal, tired of carrying a dream. By the mid-1930s, the sky had changed. What seemed like a miracle only a few years ago now looked like an outdated hulk. New planes were lighter, more streamlined, and economical. They didn't need water runways and didn't require an army of engineers for maintenance. The era of air giants was coming to an end, and the Dornier Do X became its last monument. When it was still standing in the hangars, gleaming with aluminum, time seemed to stand still. But outside, the world of technology was racing ahead. Machines created on different principles, with more powerful and reliable engines, less mass and lower costs, were taking to the sky. The Do X was increasingly compared to the past. Newspapers that had once written about it with enthusiasm now cautiously referred to it as a magnificent but inefficient marvel. Funding for the project plummeted. Even those who had once supported Dornier began to look away when they met him. Investments went into new directions: aerodynamics, turbo superchargers, and metal monoplanes that could fly higher and farther than any flying boat. There was no place for the giant, which grew out of the romanticism of the 20s, in the world of the 30s. The Do X's engines failed more often. Any one of the 12 could break down, and each such failure turned into a costly repair. The plane required care like a living creature: oil, checks, adjustments, and the replacement of parts that no one produced anymore. Engineers understood. Every new attempt to return it to the sky turned into a battle with relentless old age. Even nature seemed to turn against it. Wind, waves, humidity. Everything that had once seemed a natural environment for a seaplane now became a threat. The floats, which once provided stability, now cracked under the stress. Every takeoff became a risk, every flight a test of endurance and patience. With each month, the hangar became quieter. Mechanics left, projects were closed, and Dornier himself came there alone more often. He walked along the empty hull, touching the metal with his fingers, as if saying goodbye to what had been a part of his life. He understood. The Do X didn't lose due to mistakes. It was simply born too early. The world it appeared in was not yet ready for such machines. For the engineers who had created it, this realization was bitter. They looked at their work, at this colossal structure, where every bolt held the trace of their hands, and realized that they had created not a means, but a symbol of the aspiration for the impossible. And while new generations of planes were already taking off in other countries, the Do X stood on the water, reflected in it as in a mirror of the past. It no longer roared its engines or raised a wake, but it still drew attention. Even motionless, it remained the embodiment of a dream that lacked only one thing: time. When the roar of the engine subsided and the hangars emptied, the Do X became a shadow of itself, huge, majestic, and motionless. It was no longer being prepared for flights, its instruments were not checked, and no fuel was loaded. The waters it once skimmed now reflected it like a mirror in which time had stopped. People came to it not as a machine, but as a memory. It stood like a monument to the era when man first believed that the sky could become a road. Its hull slowly faded, the paint peeled. But even in this decay, there was something magnificent. Children looked at it with admiration, adults with a slight sadness. They saw not an outdated plane, but the personification of a dream that flew higher than its creators. When the Do X was transferred to a museum, it was greeted as a hero returned from war. People walked around it, peered inside the cabin, touched the walls that held stories of fear and ecstasy, of courage and defeat, of how far man can go if he decides to see it through. Even without sound, its presence spoke louder than any speech. For Claude Dornier, it was not a defeat. He understood that every era chooses its symbols and that his creation simply turned out to be a bridge between dream and reality. The Do X did not become mass transport, did not change the market, and did not bring profit. But it did something else. It showed that the limits of the possible exist only until someone decides to break them. And although years erased its luster and progress marched on, its shadow still lived in new planes. In every jetliner, in every line of a streamlined hull, in every idea about the future of aviation, there was an echo of what began once on the shore of Lake Constance. The Do X became a legend not because it flew, but because it dared to dream. It proved that defeat does not cancel out greatness if it is born of faith. Its story remained not in blueprints, but in memory, where dreams do not rust. And when someone today looks at an old photograph of the giant flying boat with 12 engines and thinks, how how did they dare to do that? It is at that very moment that Claude Dornier's dream takes to the sky again, quietly but surely, as a reminder that true legends do not disappear. They simply become a reflection of light on the water.